Hello, everyone. I give you a warm welcome to this presentation. We will explore some aspects of one of the deepest and most esoteric teachings ever given to mankind, the Bhagavad Gita. This summit of philosophical thought comes in the shape of an exquisite piece of literature written in an old language called Sanskrit. So, the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita, indeed, there's so much wisdom and philosophical thought behind its words that it is well nigh impossible to capture its very essence in a few words. In fact, no approach can do justice to its richness of meaning and vastness of wisdom, no matter how learned and insightful the speaker may be. So, this presentation will specifically focus on aspects connected with the challenges of the spiritual disciple and the problems and goals ahead of us all. In Western society and scholarly environments, the Sanskrit language was truly groundbreaking. During the time HPB was writing The Secret Doctrine, the language and literature of India was being disclosed to Western scholars. For those early linguists, it came almost as a surprise that this language, so ancient and deep, so full of the deepest philosophy and thought, belonged to our own stem. And those young officers arriving for the first time at their new home among the rice fields of India during the British occupation, or in the heat and dust of a desert cantonment, would commonly be told by some well-meaning old India hand that if they wished to grasp the essence of the Eastern tradition, they should read one book, the Mahabharata, by far the world's oldest and largest epic poem, and with 100,000 verses, exceeding the Bible and all Shakespeare's plays bundled together. For those who love classical literature, it would be very interesting to know that the length of this poem far exceeds Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which narrate the famous Trojan War and the return of Odysseus to Ithaca, his homeland. Western scholars virtually refuse to acknowledge that this poem can be older than Homer's epic poems, since they are considered to be the summit of Western literature. Indeed, Greece and India have contributed complementary outlooks on the world. In the Greek temple, we find the perfect definition of beauty, while in the temple of India, we find the sense of the eternal and sublime. India's gift to the world is the bliss of the infinite in the inner world. India is truly a lost chapter in Western history, even when linguistics has presented enough proof that India belongs to our own root race. This stem was called Indo-European, and this is just a scholarly classification for those who inhabit the Indian subcontinent. Sanskrit is undisputedly the root of most of our modern languages, and its antiquity can hardly be imagined. This great epic poem, the Mahabharata, was even called the fifth Veda, relying also on its attribution to Vyasa, the legendary compiler of the Vedas. The Mahabharata declares itself a new Veda for a new era intended for all people. And what's very important for us now, as a jewel within the heart of this poem, lies the Bhagavad Gita, itself a chapter, a book of this poem. Mahabharata means something like the great India or the great humanity, because humanity, understood as the fifth race, is said to descend from original India. The composer is Vyasa, himself a character in the epic. According to tradition, he dictated the verses and the god, Ganesha, wrote them down. Among the 100,000 verses of the Mahabharata, over 800 verses are considered to be the author's secret message. In Sanskrit, Vyasa Rahasya. Vyasa used to recite such verses, just gaining time to compose the next ones. It was agreed that Vyasa should dictate the stanzas continuously and without pause, or the god should stop taking dictation. Even today in India, there are thousands of these verses are still sung. The inherent meter and rhythm of the text facilitate memorization. So, what is the story about? Let us first of all know the framework of the Bhagavad Gita itself, a part of this great epic poem. The story revolves around two sets of cousins, the Pandava, the 5 sons of the king Pandu, and the Kaudava, the sons of Pandu's brother, the blind king Dhritarashtra. These two branches of the family would become bitter rivals and oppose each other in a war for the land. The Kaudava had a grotesque demonic birth, while the Pandava were actually fathered by gods and are assisted throughout the story by divinities and seers, including the very author of the poem, Vyasa. Each of the 5 brothers stands for a quality. Yudhishthira was born of righteousness and knowledge. He is the son of dharma. Bhima, the son of Vayu, the god of wind, is the strongest in the world. Arjuna, a main character in the Bhagavad Gita, son of the god Indra, is a perfect warrior. And the next 2 are twins, Nakula and Sahadeva, the higher and the lower mind, knowledge and wisdom, the polar opposites. Of the 5 brothers, Arjuna is the commander-in-chief of the Pandava army, and Krishna is his charioteer. Krishna, an incarnation of the god Vishnu, the Christ or love aspect of God, is the symbol of the divine soul who imparts life-giving wisdom to the human or incarnated soul, the disciple Arjuna. The symbol of a charioteer is one that occurs in the Upanishads and in the dialogues of Plato. We come here to a very important point, symbolism. The Mahabharata is so full of meaning that there's always an inner significance to be found behind all the events and characters. Symbolism is like beauty. Either you see it or you do not, but it is always there. So the tension between both groups of cousins escalates and ends up in a monumental confrontation. The rival hosts face each other on the field of Kurukshetra, or the field of Kuru. It is at this point that the Bhagavad Gita commences, according to HPV, a deeply esoteric literary work. Suddenly, Arjuna loses confidence in everything he's about to do, in everything he's supposed to do as a warrior. As soon as he was about to sound the horn to launch the battle, he falls down at Krishna's feet and says, and please this time allow me to paraphrase and sum it up. He said, "I cannot fight. Krishna, my legs grow weak, my mouth is drying, my body trembles, and my hair stands on end. My bow slips from my hands, and my skin burns all over. I'm not able to stand. My mind is whirling. Teachers, fathers, sons, as well as grandfathers, mothers, brothers, fathers-in-law, grandsons, brothers-in-law, and other relatives, they're all there. These I do not wish to kill. It is then that Krishna turns to face him, whispering to him a teaching that becomes the Bhagavad Gita, or the Song of the Lord Krishna. I wonder if you realize how unusual and unique this situation is, never seen in literature before. While tension builds up between two armies right at the moment of concentrated silence before the horror is unleashed, Krishna, in the middle of the battlefield, discloses to Arjuna the most sacred wisdom, teachings on yoga. If you give it some thought, it is truly amazing. Let us pause for a moment to consider why H.P. Blavatsky, what she meant when she qualified the Bhagavad Gita as profoundly occult and esoteric. She hinted that it is an epic story which symbolically depicts the challenges every spiritual disciple has to face. It could rightly be called allegory, a story used as a metaphor and intended to teach us something, if we can truly unveil its hidden meaning. In the case of the Bhagavad Gita, let us notice that it deals mainly with the challenges of the disciple up to the point when he meets his soul face to face and finds his inner being. It is not some cryptic and difficult treatise on the affairs of an initiate or an adept. The Bhagavad Gita is useful for all of us aspirants, and the challenges with which Arjuna, the symbol of the disciple, faces are the problems of all disciples throughout the ages. It tells us much about our dilemmas, his battle with polarities, until in that supreme moment of transfiguration, he finds himself face to face with his own divinity. We have said that the Mahabharata is an epic poem, and therefore also the Bhagavad Gita. And by this we imply two very relevant things. First, that it is a text with a specific rhythm and meter. The words of the Sanskrit language, as well as those of most of the ancient languages, such as Greek, is made up of syllables which have a measure, and to recite means to sing. There's a particular intonation to the text. And however, and especially important for us now, who are dealing with the symbolic content of the text. It is a text of an epic nature, since its story is related with battles and conquest, as well as with heroic deeds. But here's the rub, the crux of the matter. This war is a metaphor of a battle that takes place inside the human being. The hero is the disciple who is submitted to tests and recognitions. This disciple, Arjuna, is advised, instructed by Krishna, himself a god. This is again an inner experience, since Krishna stands for the inner divinity, the very soul of man, itself a reflection of his immortal spirit. Which is then the conflict that the disciple faces at this point. What kind of a war is it? Arjuna, in the Kurukshetra, the field of Kuru, the battlefield, stands face to face with a terrible conundrum. All his acquaintances, family, friends, even his own master or guru, are arrayed to battle against him. They are on the opposite side, and he, as a warrior, must slaughter them. Let us for a moment take a look at this powerful and deeply symbolic image. On this field, well named Dharmakshetram, or the field of Dharma or duty, the opposing forces of the Pravritti Marga, the downward involutionary arc or path which leads into the heart of form, matter, and experience in the lower world, and those of the Nivritti Marga, the path of return to the source. Those two paths face the troubled aspirant who has to make a choice. Shall he cowardly flee from duty and revert to the downward path, or proceed with courage and do what he has to do? In turn, Krishna, symbol of the inner soul, the higher self, stands poised in observation of the conflict of unleashed forces. And it is at this point that Arjuna realizes that everything is battle. Who are really his enemies? His familiar things, his attachments with whom age-long relationship and dependence has been established along the path of countless incarnations. The moment the battle is about to start justly symbolizes his transcendental decision to abandon the way of death, of form and separation, and to step on the inward path, that path of return to the source of all being. The dream of the incarnated soul has led to all kinds of contracts with time and space. The incarnating human being has submitted itself to all kinds of guidance, religions, and traditions. He has now to let go, to move on. Even if this involves the sacrifice of all these dear things on the altar of life. When the bow slips from his hands, Arjuna feels an unbearable sadness, the inevitable experience of all of us who seek the spiritual path, sometimes at least. He realizes that he's attached to institutions, standards of behavior, and established beliefs. They are his family, so to say. The hosts of its own desires stand armed against him. Not only his low desires, but every desire, like living a comfortable life, enjoying pleasure, and even being loved. This experience of vishada, or pain, is absolutely necessary, as we can see in the fact that Buddha himself pointed to desire as the cause of suffering. On the other hand, the voice of Krishna, the soul, can only be heard in silence, whispered into the ears. While the heart is filled with the roar of a battle, this higher voice cannot be heard. So, with a heavy heart, we just have a look at what Arjuna says. He says, "My heart is weighed down with the vice of faintness. My mind is confused as to duty." Or, in another way to translate it, I am afflicted by weakness and faintness. I am afflicted, upahata, by weakness, karpanya, and faintness, dosha. I ask you, what is best? I am confused, samudha, in my heart, as to my dharma. Thus, Arjuna, disoriented and with a feeling of futility, that feeling that everything is in vain, by the way of feeling so familiar to all of us who seek the spiritual life, cries, "I will not fight, Nayotsya." Krishna, seeing that Arjuna refused to take his weapons and fight, tells him to drop that cowardly attitude and begins to whisper the deepest teaching about right action and thought, duty and the path. In other words, about dharma. It tells him that victory and defeat are the same. He urges him to act, but not to reflect on the fruit of the action, or phalam. If you're a warrior, you must do your duty, your dharma, namely to fight, even if it means killing others. Once you have made pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat the same, then you will be ready for battle. We may wonder, what kind of an inner war is here symbolized? In the end, all those warriors appear as external symbols of the real slayer of reality, that desire associated with the mind, which the Theosophical literature calls kamamanas. Desire is an universal energy, neither good nor bad, but it is the mind behind desire, what the voice of the silence calls the slayer of the real. Krishna tells Arjuna to seek detachment and fight without desire. But Arjuna is confused. How can one seek detachment and yet be urged to slaughter? On the surface, these words appear to be ambiguous, but the fact is that a deeper truth is here hinted at. Krishna enjoins him not to withdraw from action or from the world. One must act, but action must not dominate the warrior. The point is, how could one put all that into practice when the mind is so unstable, evasive, turbulent, and harder to subdue than taming the wind? But soon came the answer in the shape of an ancient art. In the heart of action, one must remain free from all attachment, since sages look equally on a brahmana adorned with learning, vidya, and humility, vinaya, a cow, an elephant, and even a dog and an outcast. Being detached from the outer world of phenomena involves a transcendental recognition that there is an observer, a seer, and that although we identify ourselves with our ideas and identity, this is just the outer layer of the mind, its concrete aspects. It is said that the senses are great. Greater than the senses is the mind. Greater than the mind is pure reason or buddhi. But what is greater than reason is He, the Supreme. These verses are deeply meaningful. They suggest that there's so much more beyond the mind. In other words, within this mental field, manas, a knower, an observer, the soul is found, internal reflection of the eternal Atman. We thus find an echo of the teachings of Patanjali as he discriminates between the knower, the mental field, and thought forms. Beyond the mental field, the realm of pure reason or intuition is found. It seems that the individual soul, the seat of individuality at the midpoint between the lower and higher mind, must eventually weave a bridge, an antahkarana, towards the spiritual triad. This fusion with the Buddhic nature is perhaps the promise of escape from the maya or illusion of the world. The disciple can hold his mind steady in the light and be fixed on that high point in close contact with his essence. Then a higher level of attention is needed so that the inner focus can be turned from the outer world of effects to the inner world of causes. And this deep attention is perhaps hinted at in one of the most remarkable shlokas or stanzas of the Bhagavad Gita. In that which is the night of all beings, the yogi is awake. That in which all beings are awake is the night of the sage who sees. In that which is the night, nisha, of all beings, the yogi is awake, jagrati. That in which all beings are awake, jagrati, is the night of the sage who sees. I think its meaning becomes evident for any intuitive mind. The word of the sage who has found enlightenment would be darkness, night, something incomprehensible for anyone attached to the experience of the senses and self-centered desire. The incarnated soul then dreams the dream of the ages until it awakes. It is in this field, unknown for the ordinary human being, that the sage is active, awake, because it is his field of service. On the other hand, what all beings attached to form consider alive, interesting, worthy of attention, that life is futile, vain for the sage, even equivalent to death. Therefore, the Muni or sage does not take active part in a life which he has already experienced for countless incarnations and outgrown naturally. At one point, Arjuna asks how the Supreme can be approached. Krishna answers that in this world there are two ways of faith and devotion. Dve vidhanishta, namely two paths, the jnana yoga, the yoga of wisdom, and the karma yoga, the yoga of action. The difficult subject of action is dealt with in the third chapter or song. As everything is unending vibration in eternal duration, nothing and no one can be without action. But it will be detached action, the concern of the sage, the human being who performs the needed action without attachment to its fruits or results. This is only possible when we break free from the binding of desire. This involves a complete change in polarization, in attitude, and it has nothing to do with retiring from the world or escaping one's duties. It does imply moving against the mainstream of socially accepted behavior and becoming a real spiritual warrior. We know that, don't we? The problem of action is one of the most difficult matters to truly understand. Krishna poses the question, what is action? Kim karma. What is inaction? Kim akarma. He further adds that even the wise are herein perplexed, difficult, mysterious. Gahana is the path of action, says Krishna. He who sees inaction in action, and action in inaction, he is wise among men. And I wonder if we could also translate this sentence as he who sees silence in action and action in silence, he is wise among men. In a way, I believe the Bhagavad Gita relates this deep silence and peace with the energy of the soul. It is the disciple who raises himself to those heights, so to say. And I find it interesting to see this in terms of altitude. In the 6th chapter, the yogi is depicted as on a high place, kutaha, sthitaha, that is on a summit, on a high rock. This sense of altitude pointing to an unwavering position in spiritual realms. Can we imagine how different our lives would be should we be able to sustain our center of consciousness on that high point? The picture of the summit of a high mountain is just a symbol, as we can guess. No one is saying that the disciple should withdraw to a lonely place on the top of the mountain. We can think of a disciple holding his mind steady in the light of the soul, that middle point between the higher mind and the lower personality. Or we could extend the reach of our imagination and picture a great initiate holding his consciousness in the realms of the spiritual triad. the realm of intuition and pure will? What would be the effect in our lives, and what our usefulness? Should we be able to turn the focus of the mind towards the world of causes, while considering this world of phenomena as a field of service or training? The yogi remains in a secret place by himself, says the Bhagavad Gita. The awakened human being remains in a secret place by himself, rahasistita, permanently with thought and self subdued. That is, always with the body, mind, and self seated, poised on that high place. His consciousness is steady in the light of that high point within the mind. It's apex, so to say, in Krishna's words, in a sacred place, neither very much raised nor very low. Shuchaudeshe, in a holy land, but not too high, not too low, in that middle land in which the higher and the lower meet, the land of the soul, the real self in terms of reflection of the monad. He can consciously direct the focus towards the realms of the spiritual triad, the realm of intuition, or to the outer world in service. The soul thus turns out to be a lamp which does not flicker in a windless place. Thus the joy of the eternal is known, as well as that land where truth resides. This union or synthesis is what freedom really means. Freedom, as once Ravi Ravindra said, not for oneself, but from oneself. The disciple sees himself within the heart of all beings and sees all beings within his own heart. This is truly a renunciation. Krishna tells Arjuna that the man who relinquishes all attachment, does not crave, does not hate, and is committed to the yoga of sacred action. Sacred action involves detached action. In other words, sacred service. It is free from polar opposites and merged with the inner light. This by no means loss of contact with the outer world, where the disciple should be serving, but the beginning of a real usefulness as an outpost of the master and the groove on the inner side. But if passion drags us away and darkness dulls our senses, how can this summit, this high point, this higher intelligence be found? Arjuna asks. To reply to this question, Krishna taught Arjuna the ancient yoga of wisdom and the mysterious path of action. He revealed Arjuna's true battlefield, himself, where you need neither warriors nor weapons, for each man must fight alone. He spoke for a very long time between the two waiting armies preparing to destroy themselves. Krishna instructs Arjuna in terms of what right action and right thought are. The problem of dharma underlies Arjuna's bewilderment, as we have seen. He was confused because he fails to see where his dharma lies. Dharma, or right action, is the main motive of the whole poem. Vyasa, as a character, points out that the whole poem was written so as to engrave dharma in the hearts of men. Right action, or dharma, involves acting for the soul irrespective of what this world demands and of what those revered pronouncements of science and religions, dogmas. One must have courage, virya, to live his own dharma. The very motto of the Theosophical Society affirms that there is no dharma higher than the truth. This is highly meaningful and in no way implies that we as Theosophists are in possession of the ultimate truth, which is humanly impossible. It means that the best course of action, the best path, is what the honest aspirant in a specific moment of his or her development senses and recognizes as the truth. When we think of the word truth, satyam in Sanskrit, we refer to the knowledge of the inner causes, a gradual awakening, since each step reveals new horizons, and only he about whom naught can be said knows the absolute truth, at least that belonging to his own sphere. And as the Rig Veda states, perhaps not even he himself knows it. That's why we have this motto, there's no dharma higher than the truth. Satyat nasti paro dharma. Thus, on the Kurukshetram, the battlefield of the Bhagavad Gita, the disciple Arjuna bears witness to an inner recognition from which there is no return. He sees his illusions vanish one by one. So much so that he finally begged Krishna to show him his Vishvarupa, or universal form. In other words, he wanted to see his soul face to face. In this climaxing moment of transfiguration, Arjuna, overwhelmed with deep astonishment and awe, bowed down his head to the Shining One and said with joined palms and shaken to the depth, I see you everywhere, unbounded form, beginning, middle, end, nor your source I find, infinite Lord, infinite form, blazing as fire, the gaze dazzling as the sun, immeasurable forms all sides of the sky. And to that, the universal form of Vishnu replied, Time I am, laying desolate the world, made manifest on earth to slay mankind. Not one of these warriors ranged for battle escapes death. You alone will survive. I have already defeated all these warriors. You alone will survive death. It is the spiritual disciple's task in some way to overcome death. Then, in the 9th song or chapter, Krishna reveals a supreme mystery, Raja Vidya, in his words, the most secret wisdom, Raja Guhyam, transcendent, Uttamam, the most pure. This supreme knowledge is only transmitted through direct experience, pratyaksha. Those who do not believe in those truths return to incarnation, to the samsara over and over again. By me, all this world is pervaded in my invisible being. All beings have their roots in me, and I am not rooted in them. Krishna tells Arjuna to meditate on this sacred mystery. I am the source of all beings, Bhuta Bhavana, but he does not depend on anything or anyone. At the end of the age, Kalpakshaye, in the night of times when everything returns to the bosom of nature, in Pralaya, everything returns to my nature, he says, and when a new day begins, I bring them back to life. The ancient philosophers, both in Western and Eastern lands, have observed that everything changes, and the life forces in a universe are incessantly working as the river of Heraclitus. Not for a moment they become motionless. The universe comes into being because a cosmic entity is embodying itself, and a universe dies as a human being dies because it has come to the point where the major part of its energies have already passed into invisible realms. The same fundamental laws prevail in the great as in the small. Death is only a change. Life on earth is only 1 minute in the life of our souls. The only enduring thing is pure consciousness, which includes everything else. The doctrine of cycles is a highly important chapter of the esoteric philosophy, as we read in the Secret Doctrine, because repetitive and rhythmic action is fundamental in nature. Every being and thing exists as an expression of rhythmic pulsation. We are not only immersed in cycles greater than ourselves, but actually within our own being embody cycles because we are all cyclical in our life processes. The laws of cycle is a part of the harmony of the spheres because it provides rhythm, number, and a system of durations in which silence and rest are as important as sound and activity. The law of periodicity and constant renewal is based on the principle that to each period of activity follows a period of rest, followed by another period of activity, and so on. Thus, evolution works. The relationship between eternity and cyclical periods of activity is beautifully summed up in the three fundamental propositions in Blavatsky's poem to the Secret Doctrine. The first of these proposition postulates an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception. An intuitive mind would understand that the substratum of this universe must necessarily be an eternal principle, since that which is the causeless cause from which everything springs cannot be born or perish. It must be eternal and independent of any conceivable limitation. The idea of absoluteness makes the mind silent, but it is by all means a far better explanation than a personal God who creates the world out of nothing. This substratum is this limitless and eternal principle of the first proposition. From that, the universe is irradiated, emanated, that remaining independent and unaffected by whatever reaches manifestation. It is the source of everything, the underpinning structure, but at the same time it remains an unconditioned reality. In the second proposition, that absolute and infinite nature underlying everything is shown to be the playground of numberless universes, incessantly manifesting and disappearing. They do so on the backdrop of eternity. The opportunities for development are always associated with appearance and disappearance, birth and death, as a basic necessity for all renovation, because it leads towards new and greater possibilities. When there is renewal and progress, there is something that has to die, to be reborn again, something incomplete that requires new and more appropriate resources. This necessary renewal turns out to be the very fuel for development, for the forces that keep the whole universe running must never be exhausted and need recharging. We heard Krishna saying, "Everything returns to my nature," the universal person of Krishna says. And when the new day begins, I bring them back to life. Puna visarjami aham, I create them anew. The third proposition affirms the identity of all those sparks springing from the one source with a great flame. All those sparks must go through cyclical incarnations in accordance with the universal karmic law, which constantly balances the forces, not allowing scarcity or overflowing, the law of universal balance. And the reason for all these cycles, periodicity, we find in one of the most extraordinary statements Blavatsky ever made. The Secret Doctrine teaches the progressive development of everything, worlds as well as atoms. And this stupendous development has neither conceivable beginning nor imaginable end. Our universe is only one of an infinite number of universes, all of them sons of necessity, because links in the great cosmic chain of universes, each one standing in relation of an effect as regards its predecessor and being a cause as regards its successor. So the picture thus appears extraordinary. Behind change, there's always an eternal, an undying nature. Back to the battle. Right at the beginning of it, when Arjuna laid down his weapons and refused to fight, Krishna revealed this truth, saying that the human spirit is immortal. He who thinks he can kill and he who thinks that can be killed are both mistaken. No one can work the destruction of the imperishable one. In other words, no weapon can pierce the life that informs a human being. He, the spirit, is not born, not jayate, nor does he die, namriyate. Having been, he does not cease to be. He is unborn, ajaha, eternal, nitya, and the most ancient, Purana. He is not slain when the body is slaughtered. Our spirit is eternal. No fire can burn it. No water can drench it. No wind can make it dry. And so, thus the final admonition is heard. And please allow me to summarize it. Have no fear and rise up. I myself am never without action, says the universal form of Krishna. It is with this detachment that Arjuna can sound the horn, even with the horrors of the inevitable war. I guess you might like to know how the whole story ends. After all we have covered, we are certainly entitled to do it, don't we? Well, in the end, the Pandava will conquer. But it will be a victory that will deeply trouble them. As soon as the Bhagavad Gita is over, the Mahabharata continues and the battle is launched. The horror is unleashed, and the Mahabharata takes the issue of violence to such an extreme that the limits between right or wrong, good or evil, become completely blurred. There's so much bloodshed that one is tempted into the conclusion that the story has a core of historical truth, being perhaps an account of the great battle in Atlantis. The tendency to assign a core of reality to legends and myths is called euhemerism, a word used by HPB in Isis Unveiled and so little understood. Perhaps one day we can talk about myth. But in the end of all things, there's no enemy, there's no ally. The end of every war, isn't it? Who can be said to really win? Ultimately, the Pandava embark upon a great journey towards the heights of the Himalayas. One by one, they fall into the abyss and perish, including Arjuna. Yudhishthira, the son of Dharma, is left alone with a dog that has followed him faithfully all the way. At the gates of heaven, he is told to give up on the dog, lest the entrance into the higher realms be denied. He completely refused to leave the defenseless creature alone. And this was a test. The dog is his father. Who else than the god Dharma? Another test awaits in heaven, where the king finds his enemies. His brothers are in hell, where the king Yudhishthira chooses to remain as well, with whom he considers to be his family. eventually, he realizes that that was the final test, the test of illusion, Maya. He understood that there is neither paradise nor hell, that there was no happiness, no punishment, no family, no enemies, only one life. In those realms, words and thoughts end. That was his last illusion. And thus ends the greatest epic poem of all time. What is the message of the Bhagavad Gita, we may wonder? Among many possibilities, I think it is mainly the message of dharma. It teaches that behind form, there's a thinker who uses a form. If there's a core message in Krishna's words, it would perhaps be, step out of illusion, be who you essentially are, the spiritual being. The Bhagavad Gita is truly a treatise on the soul. It contains a complete picture of a soul and its unfoldment. Just one of the books every disciple should have at hand. This is what I wanted to share with you. As it is said in Sanskrit, Dhanyavadaha. Thank you very much, and namaste.